Hello, and welcome once again to Family Historian. My name is Stephen Conte. We all have chapters in our lives. Some are sad and some are happy, but hey, that's life. And tonight we are going to learn how to write the story of our life. And joining me on tonight's show, I am very honored to have as my guest a remarkable man. His name is Major Richard Talbot. Major Talbot is the author of 3 books, and one of these books is called The Autumn of My Time. And on tonight's show, Major Talbot is going to teach us how we too can write the story of our lives. And now let's welcome historian, author, Vietnam vet, painter, magician, businessman, you name it, he does it, Major Richard Talbot. Welcome to my show, sir.
Thank you very much for having me.
Good. Now, I know you like being called Pete, so I'll call you Pete.
Okay.
Okay. You know, I read your book, The Autumn of My Time, over the summer, and I was very impressed. You don't pull any punches.
Yeah.
You mentioned the good times, the bad times, and that's life.
That is life.
The highs and the lows of life. And as a baby boomer, I was able to relate to much of what you had written down because I lived in this era, part of this era anyway. Tell me, what inspired you, Pete, to write this book?
Well, a number of years ago, my mother was celebrating her 85th birthday, and I started to think, what can I really do for her? She doesn't need gifts and things, but I said, what if I gave her a little family history of all the old stories I can remember and put them down for her as a nice gift?
Yes, and that was the beginning of it.
Yes, it was. And my brothers and sisters said, well, Pete, why don't you expand it and do more about the family? Because we love what the 20 pages that you wrote, and it would be very interesting to have for the family.
And when did you start the formal writing of your book?
It must have been about 1995 to 2000.
Right, and this was published in what year?
I actually don't remember. I think it was published around 2012, something of that nature.
Right. Now, you're a Jersey boy.
Yes.
And you were born and raised in what town?
Mendham, New Jersey.
Mendham, New Jersey.
I was.
And we do have photographs of your old homestead. And then you lived in Bernardsville.
Correct.
At one time. And your family goes way back.
Yeah, well, my grandmother...
In New Jersey.
Right. My grandmother traced our origins to around 1560, I believe.
Right.
And she paid someone in England to actually go through cemeteries and look at gravestones and record our family tree for us.
Right. So in writing your life story, you always add your genealogy because it's part of your life story.
Of course.
Your ancestry. And you also have a nephew or cousin, I believe, who
Yes.
is a genealogist and did extensive research on the Talbot line. Is that correct?
Yes. What happened, my brother John had our records that my grandmother had paid for. And his son Damon Talbot was a historian and a genealogist, so we turned all the papers over to him. And he was actually able to create a great family tree.
Right.
And which shows our family lineage back to around 1560s.
And we do have a photo of this very impressive family tree that goes way back into the 1500s. Now, in doing this research, you discovered, and I discovered, that Pete has some very famous and very infamous ancestors. Let's start with the famous ancestor, and who was that?
That's Benjamin Franklin. I couldn't believe it when we saw that. I don't know, 15th cousin 10 times removed or something.
Right, now he's on the Talbot side.
That's correct.
Okay, now your mother's maiden name is?
Booth.
Okay, and who was the infamous ancestor on that side?
Unfortunately, an assassin named John Wilkes Booth.
John Wilkes Booth.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, when you found out this information, I know Ben Franklin, you were very proud of having
Got that right.
patriot. Yeah. The other one, John Wilkes Booth, it's a fact of life, or how did you?
Well, it was an interesting tidbit that I didn't go into.
I see. Okay. So in other words, on your mother's side, it's John Wilkes Booth, and your father is Ben Franklin.
Correct.
Very interesting. Now let's go way back in your life now,
Okay.
okay? You said you were born in,
1934
okay, and the town?
was Mendham, New Jersey.
Mendham, New Jersey, okay. Now, while in high school, you were a bit of a jock, and can you tell our viewers about that?
Yes, well, I wasn't a great student. However, I did play a lot of football and baseball. I was a knuckleball pitcher, and our team won the county championship in 1952. And our coach had some connections with the Yankee farm system and was actually able to get us to pitch batting practice at Yankee Stadium.
And when you did this, you had the great privilege of meeting two very famous baseball players. Can you tell our viewers about that? Because I read that in the book.
Well, I pitched against Phil Rizzuto and Yogi Berra, both of them who were my heroes.
Right.
Rizzuto got a few nice hits out off my pitches, but Yogi Berra put about 10 of them in the stands.
Very good. Okay, and then you re-met these guys many years later, and we'll talk about that as we go on with your life.
Okay.
Now, Ohio State, that's the college you went to.
I did.
Okay, and tell us about that.
Well, I went there as a state student because my grandfather had graduated from there, even though we lived in New Jersey. And the interesting thing is, again, I was not a great student. I made the dean's list for 2 semesters,
Yeah.
and it was the wrong end, and I was asked to leave.
I see.
Yes.
Okay. But then you did years later get your college degree. If you can tell our viewers about that.
Well, later when I was in the service, I was an officer, and as an officer, you had to have a college degree. And in 1971, the Army allowed me to go on a leave of absence to Hampton Institute, where I was accepted as a college senior. I graduated in 1 year.
So you were a late bloomer in
I
that
certainly
area.
was really late.
Okay. Now let's go back again. 1953. That was a big year in your life. Can you tell our viewers about that?
Well, in 53, I had just dropped out of Ohio State. My mother said, you better go and enlist because the Korean War is on and you're going to get drafted. You might as well do something that you want to do. And the recruiter in Morristown, who signed me up, convinced me to go to helicopter mechanic school in Fort Sill, Oklahoma to start my Army career.
And you became a mechanic?
Yes, the world's worst helicopter mechanic.
Okay. But then you also went to flight school at that time.
Well, I was assigned to a company in Fort Benning, Georgia, where they flew H-19s.
Yeah.
And they found out how bad a mechanic I was. So in the long term, I became a mailman and then a bartender in the Army. And all the officers who were at the officers club convinced me to apply for flight school, which I did, and went in 1957.
1957. Then you told me a very comical story. Only Major Pete Talbot could do this. And it has a lot to do with Bernardsville and the helicopter. Can you tell our viewers that very unusual and comical story?
Well, after I graduated from flight school, I was assigned to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, to a helicopter company. And we had CH-34 helicopters, and 4 of them had to be flown to Bridgeport, Connecticut for maintenance. So I was one of the crew on one of the aircraft, and we got separated from the other 3 aircraft, and we were about 2 hours behind them as we approached New Jersey on the cross country to Bridgeport. So I said to my co-pilot, I said, our airplane really doesn't sound very good. Why don't we land at my house, have lunch, and we'll let our crew chief look things over, which was a total story. So we landed, and we lived on the mountain in Bernardsville, and there weren't a lot of homes around us. So I figured we'd be fine because you're not really supposed to land on private property.
Right.
So we had a great lunch with my mother and aunt. Everybody was having a good time. We went back out to the helicopter. It was surrounded by 50 people who had congregated to see the Army's helicopters sitting on our property. Well, we waved goodbye to everybody and sheepishly left and returned to our route and landed at Bridgeport later.
And there were no repercussions.
Thank God, no one turned us in.
Isn't that something? So that was a real highlight.
It certainly was.
Now, I know we have all been watching the Ken Burns Vietnam documentary on PBS, which is excellent. And we have a man who was there in Vietnam. And you were there in what year, sir?
I was there in 65, 66, and I went back again in 68, 69.
Right.
I served 2 tours.
But you did find a time to get married during that time. Is
Well,
that correct?
On my first tour, I was single. And in those days, a lot of Americans were trying to support the troops in Vietnam, even though
Yes.
there was a lot of people against us being there.
Right.
And each weekend, the mailroom would come and with big bags of mail and dump them on the table in the mess hall, and they were addressed to any GI. So I sorted through them since I really didn't have anyone to write, and I picked out 25 letters. 17 of them were from Philadelphia, all lovely ladies. So
Yes.
I said, well, I'll correspond with them. In the meantime, I got another letter from some woman in New Jersey, and my father had put my name in a pool for people to write, and this woman wrote to me. So for the next 6, 8 months, I'm writing all these women. And I'd culled the list down to the 17 in Philadelphia and the one lady in New Jersey. When on my return, I went and called the ladies in Philadelphia. It turned out they were all nurses at the same hospital, and I took them all out to dinner.
All 17?
All 17. It cost me a bundle.
All right.
But on the flip side of the coin, I went and dated Mary Ann, who was in New Jersey, and she became my mail order wife.
And this was before your second tour
Yes,
of
it was.
Vietnam. Okay.
Correct.
So now let's talk about that second tour of Vietnam and what that was like for you.
Well, the second tour, I got over there during the Tet Offensive, and I was with the same unit, amazingly, that I had served with in the first tour, the 1st Cav Division.
Right.
And on the side note, the Marines were totally surrounded at Tay Ninh, and the 1st Cav went and relieved them.
And when did you, and this is when you became a major. Yeah,
On my first tour, I was a captain. I was promoted to major on my second tour.
I see. And that's the title that you hold now. And then when were you out of the Army?
1973.
All right. What does a retired major from the Army do? Now, this is another chapter in Pete's very interesting life. Tell us what you guys do.
Well, when I retired, I said, I got to do something. And I had gotten my real estate license for New Jersey. My aunt owned a real estate agency, so I went to work for her. And that was during the time when President Carter was president, and the interest rates had gone to 19%. I sold one house in 1 year. It was a disaster. So
Yeah.
I talked to my brothers, and one brother who was in college had created an educational game for handicapped children. And we formed a company around it, and we're in business for 3 or 4 years.
And what was the name of the company?
It was called Playco.
And this was Playco. Is that named after something? Or?
No, we just came up with it. I don't know how. And the one game that it was based around, we built other products. And Mayor Koch will always live in my heart, the wrong one, because we weren't a big company, and I had a $150,000 order for the New York City school systems. And because of budget constraints, we shipped it 3 months later. It all came back. We never got paid, and it bankrupted the company.
See, and this is what I like about Pete's book, because he mentions all the high points and the low points in his life. You don't sugarcoat anything in this book.
Well, that's life.
That's life.
That's
right.
true.
The high points and the low points. Now, after the business had closed, I have your whole life here on my outline. You had another crossing of paths with Yogi Berra. Can you tell us about that?
Well, when our company folded, my wife said to me, "What are we going to do for income?" I said, "I'm going to turn pro as a racquetball player," because I had won several national championships as an amateur.
Right.
And she said, "How are we going to make any money?" I said, "I have a connection with Yogi Berra Hall of Fame, which was a racquetball club in Fairfield, New Jersey,
Right.
on Route 46.
Yes.
So I interviewed, and they accepted me as their teaching pro. Well, in those days, racquetball was booming, and I had so many classes that we were just making great money at the time. And Yogi Berra actually would come in and hand out towels to the members. And one day I said to Yogi, Yogi, do you know you hit 10 home runs off of me at one time? He said, what are you talking about? And then I told him the story about pitching in Yankee Stadium, and we all had a big laugh.
So he remembered that.
No.
He did not remember
No, he
it.
didn't
Okay,
remember.
he did not want to remember
You
it,
got that
maybe.
right.
Right. So you've had a very interesting life, Pete. Very interesting. Now, you also mentioned that you were a community manager, and tell our viewers what that is.
Well, I had been working for a racquetball club, other than Yogi's, for a few years after I left Yogi's, and the club was being sold, so I was looking around for something else to do, and there was a community called Green Pond in North Jersey, and they were looking for a property manager. And with my experience in the Army as a maintenance officer, pilot, and in charge of a lot of people,
Yes.
I interviewed and they accepted me, and I worked there for nearly 10 years. And I left there and went back into racquetball just for a year or two.
Yes.
When the club that I went back to was sold. So my wife and I decided to retire, and we moved to Manchester, New Jersey.
Right, and that's where you are right now.
Yes. Well, we're
that
actually in
area.
Fairfield, yes.
Right.
Not Fairfield, and Freehold.
Right, in Freehold.
Right.
Now, Pete, you've had a very exceptional life, very colorful life. What do you tell people out there who say, well, gee, my life can never match yours. My life is not as interesting as yours. What could I offer? What could I write? And these are not money-making books. These are books that you can leave to your kids and your grandchildren and your descendants. It's a personal history with genealogy.
Correct.
As well, and that's what Pete has done. So tell our viewers, what can they do?
Well, when I had the idea of writing the 20 pages for my mother on her 85th birthday, I started thinking, well, there's so many old family stories that I remember from my grandmother and grandparents that were told to me. And back before TV, when we used to watch the radio, we would gather at my grandfather Booth's home on every Sunday, and everyone lived around in the general area, not like today when everyone spread state to state.
Yes.
And all the kids would be there, the grandparents, all the adults, and all the stories of the family would be told and retold. And nobody wrote them down. There was no recordings in those days.
Yes.
And I started thinking back, why not write a book about my family to record all the old stories I remember, and my life too, because I wanted to relate that to my children and my grandchildren.
Right.
So when I started that, it was amazing. I used to do a page and a half a night, just typing on a computer.
Yeah.
And one day, a program called Dragon came out, and it allowed you to use a microphone on the computer and just talk. And right on the screen, it would actually type the words, and you'd have to make corrections like the word to.
Right.
You could be TWO, TO, and so forth. But for the most part, it's very accurate. It helps with punctuation. And I was able to write 10 pages an hour. So my poor little book, or my pamphlet of 20 pages, turned into 479 pages.
And it turned into The Autumn of My Time by Major Richard Pete Talbot. So once again, everybody's life is important, even though they have not had your life. Can you reassure my viewers about that?
Well, first of all, when you think back in your family, there's many old stories that you remember. It may not be your life, but a lot of your ancestors have had adventures.
Right.
Why not find out about them by talking to your grandparents, to your aunts and uncles and so forth, and put them on paper? I self-published my books through exlibris.com, and they produce one hardcover and one softcover, and after that you buy what you want from them. And this way you can hand them out to your family. I live in a continuing care facility now with a lot of people who are older than I am, and I try to talk to everyone about writing a book about their family history so it's not lost.
And their personal lives as well.
Of course.
Because if you really think, you have had adventures, maybe not the same ones that you have experienced, but in their own personal life. And that's what you have done.
That's what I've done.
From boyhood to your teenage years, to a young man at college and then going off to Vietnam. You were in Vietnam during the war. And I'm sure that's another story right there. You have stories from that
Oh, a lot.
from that era.
Sure.
Have you been watching the Ken Burns documentary?
About Vietnam, yes. The only trouble, it does bring back some unpleasant memories. However, it's very factual and really portrays what happened over there.
You find it to be very realistic.
Oh, yes.
I see. Well, this has been a real honor having you on my show. Major Richard P. Talbot. I know you like being called Pete very much. Why? Was that a nickname that you were given?
My grandmother gave it to me because I'm a junior.
I see. Okay, great. Well, it was an honor having you on my show,
Thank
sir.
you very much.
And I'm sure we'll meet again and do another show. And thank you, folks, for watching tonight's show on Writing Your Life Story. We had a great man here who was a great influence to all of us. And on that note, as I say every week, remember, we are all descendants of ancient civilizations. Genealogy is your key to the history of your family. And so until next time, this is Stephen Conte wishing you the very best of luck in your research, and above all, happy ancestor hunting. Good night.